Welcome to the Dive Table. I'm Jay Gardner, and with me is Miss Sarah. Sarah, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm a little tired, and we'll talk about why in a bit here. But I'm in Playa del Carmen, so I'm doing great. There's a little bit of construction next to me, so I apologize to all the listeners if you hear hammers and things. There's nothing I can do about it.
Under construction. Like, aren't we all?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
It's just
good. I
life.
think, like, for this episode, exactly. Life is always, me too, actually. I don't know when this episode will air, so who knows what will have transpired in between. But yeah, I'm in a transitional period too. It's interesting. It was work wise, figuring out what's next. So under
Under
construction is a good theme.
construction. Yeah.
I think you and I were chatting about this episode, and yeah, I mean, I think we're just gonna have an off the cuff discussion about cave diving. You're in Playa right now. You're doing some cave diving.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's a great discussion to have, and we don't have a point in terms of like, you know, this is the way to cave dive, or this is the risk, or this. It's just a general discussion about cave diving because I think it's a topic that's always out there, always.
Well, and we have two very different experiences, which people would have heard if they listened to our previous episode about technical diving. Like, we have had very different experiences and have very different preferences, right? Like, I've been pretty uh vocal about the fact that I'm not super interested in like the hardcore cave technical diving kind of route, whereas like you are, and I think that's really fascinating. And I think the sport and the discipline is interesting, but it's just something that I haven't necessarily been drawn into as like that diving love affair that, coming back to our very first episode of this season, is just not like my thing. But I did want to revisit it now because I want to understand it more and I want to explore it more. So that's why I'm here, sitting in a hotel room in Playa del Carmen.
Yeah, and the caves there are considered some of the most decorated, if not the most decorated caves
Amazing.
in
Yeah.
in the world. And by decoration, if you're not familiar with that, what that means is, there's stalagmites and stalactites and different formations and things that are inside of those caves, whereas some caves are literally wet rock. I guess all caves are wet rock, but not decorated, or less decorated and things, and it varies. So you're in an amazing place to be talking about cave diving for sure.
Yeah, and somebody who was new to diving was asking because I was telling them about my previous experience. So I had gone through the full cave course about 6 or 7 years ago when I lived in Playa del Carmen, and I was telling them about the things that we would see, like those decorations that you just mentioned, or like really old bones, remnants from people that used to do things in the caves, and they're like, wait, why, how is that possible? And I guess it's not like common knowledge that those were dry, right? Like the caves were dry and the water has filled them up, and so now they're primed for diving. But that's why there's all of those kinds of decorations and everything. It's all of that formed when the caves were actually dry.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the fascinating parts of cave diving to me is that you you're literally swimming. I guess you're always swimming in history, but it feels more pronounced to me
Mm-hmm.
when you're seeing, as I'm diving in the cave, I'm thinking about, amongst a lot of other things, but one of the things that I'm awestruck by is just how the water carved that space. Like, how did that get there? Because it was dry. I remember I was in a cave in Florida, and in this particular section of the cave, there was kind of a shelf. It was a round, imagine just a tube. It felt like a tube, a larger tube, but not huge. And then halfway down the tube was kind of the shelf, and then below that the tube continued, right? And so in my mind, I was thinking, wow, I wonder if this used to be the shore, or like the edge of the river, because the water obviously was below this at some point, and it carved this path, this shelf, and then there was people, maybe I was imagining people's feet, bare feet, looking for footprints that might be in that space along that shelf. And I don't know. We went back and did some research, and it's not conclusive as to that's actually what that formation, how it was made. But it was fascinating to me, and it was something that just kept me awestruck through that section of that dive, which was incredible. So it's one of the things that draws me to that environment is that feeling. And of course you can have that with coral, you can have that with lots of different environments, but it's really I would say intense and strong for me personally when I'm in that cave environment, is that thought of, gosh, I'm just a speck. And I remember the first time I felt that, not to go too far down this feeling, but I remember it was the first time I traveled internationally, and I think I was like 17 or 18. And long story short, I somehow figured out how to get a free trip for my senior trip to Jamaica. Don't ask me how. It was a lot of
Nice.
work to get there, but I got to go to Jamaica. And was it to Jamaica? I don't know. No, it wasn't. What was it? I was on my way to Africa later. It was not Jamaica. Sorry. I'm getting my stories all mixed up. Back to that, we're old thing. But I was on my way to Africa, and I remember we stopped over in London for 2 days or something like that on the way to Africa. And I remember standing on the cobbled streets in London and thinking about, not only the horse-drawn carriages that would have gone down that street, but the people and how they built the street, and feeling like, man, I'm just this insignificant speck in the long draw of history, and how not it should make you feel bad, but it actually made me feel really secure, like that, hey, I'm okay, I'm part of this, but it's not all around me. And it was that first time I had that experience, and every time I go in a cave, I feel that way. I feel like, wow, I'm just, I'm finite, and the universe is infinite, and that's an amazing feeling to feel, in at least for me.
I think
Anyway,
that's
long way about saying I like cave diving.
no. I think that feeling is a really powerful thing to recognize, because I feel like we get so obsessed with like little stresses and things that we have to do, and then you realize how little you are and how not important most of the things are that we do, even though we have like this big importance. We're going off the deep end with this side, but I think it's comforting to realize that, like, oh, I'm actually not like, it's not a big deal. Nothing that I do, like recording this podcast, not really a big deal, like in the big scheme of things, no one's gonna die.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
So I understand that feeling. My thing with like the motivation for wanting to come back here is, I don't like it when I have an experience where I genuinely feel like stressed or fearful. Like I don't like leaving loose ends. And I feel like my last experiences in caves had those loose ends. Like I talked about it in one of my I think it was like an Instagram reel or something, where one of the times that I felt panicked underwater was in Taj Mahal, and I wasn't able to equalize, and I wasn't able to go up to help with the equalization situation. There was a literal roof over my head, and it felt really scary. Um, Obviously I got out and it was fine, but that was like a loose end in my diving book. Whereas like in other situations, like I've had some scary situations in Komodo, but I was able to go back to those dive sites and like face that fear and not rewrite, but like create different memories in those places and to learn from whatever happened. But with the caves, I didn't do that. So this was like a trip back to sort of face some things and also to develop as a diver. Like, this is the first time that I'm doing caves in a dry suit, and let me tell you, it's something. It's something.
Yeah. Well, and I think you bring up a really good point, and on the more serious aspect of that, you're right. I think maybe the way to phrase that is that the cave environment is unforgiving, right? The something like equalization, sure, is somewhat minor in the grand scheme of things that the cave won't forgive, right? And so it's a serious environment, and it's not. I know I talk about it as this love affair, and it's true, but it's something that I also have an immense amount of respect for that environment, because I know it will punish the mistakes much more severely than pretty much any other environment outside of inside of a tricky wreck, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially a cave, right? It's I mean they're essentially the same thing. They're different, but the same idea. And so it's a serious thing. It's not something to take lightly. It's not something to jump into um, half-heartedly, I think, because of the fact that it is completely an unforgiving environment. If you every mistake that you make, which of course you're a human being, you will make mistakes, is amplified by an amount because of that environment. And so, yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. It's kind of that, like, man, I got punished, and I want to go back and recuperate a little bit in that environment. Or in parenting, they talk a lot about, you know there's so many philosophies, and there's so many
I can only imagine.
ideas, and blah blah blah. But one of the things I really appreciate is look, you're as parents, you'll make mistakes. You'll lose
Mm-hmm.
your patience at some point. I know. I think I found, like, there's a limit at something like 18 times of, like, dealing with the conflict, where I just, like, I'm rubbed so raw, I just can't, and I'm just like, just go to your room for a minute. I need a minute. Like, and you'll lose it. You'll make mistakes. You'll say the wrong thing. Today, driving my kids to school, for example, my youngest just sings at the top of her lungs, and my others were
Oh
trying to have
God.
a conversation, and the little is just, like, belting out something at the top of her lungs, and she's in her own world. Like, you could say her name, you could say, like, fire, you could say anything, she's just in her own world. And so I raised my voice to, like, break through her singing, and I realized, crap, like, I'm telling her in some way, like, your dad is going to yell if you sing. And even though that's not what I was trying to communicate, that's what I did communicate. So you're going to make mistakes. And what I really like about the idea in parenting, or what I've latched onto, is that it's not about whether or not you make mistakes, because you will. It's about, how do you, recuperate? How do you repair? Coming back to the fact, and admit that to your kid. Hey, look, I made a mistake. I'm sorry I did that. Or I'm really, and without saying, well, if you didn't do this, I wouldn't have done that. It's just saying, I'm sorry, I'm human. I made a mistake. I want to repair that. And that's something I've really latched onto in parenting. And I think it's kind of what you're saying in some ways around caves, or other punishing environments, is when you have that rough experience, whatever it is, you want to come back for the rejoinder, the repair, right? To recuperate a little bit. And that's, ego. That's, your psyche.
Oh.
That's, like, your confidence, all sorts of things is built into that. And I think it's
Oh
important.
yeah. I have to say, because my cave instructor, basically, I'm here taking a cave refresher and then doing some fun diving. And my instructor for the cave refresher, he's got a 1-year-old. And I listen to stories from him and from you and my other friends who have kids, and I'm like, more power to you guys. Like, not for me, bro.
Yeah. I love my kids. It's no doubt you love your kids. No doubt they're an incredible, responsibility, all of those things. And someday my kids, maybe they'll listen to this. I don't think they'll ever listen to it, but if they do, they know that I love them. But I do describe parenthood sometimes as you're just on that knife's edge between, on one side of it is, wow, this is incredible, lovely, all the things that the movies make kids out to be. On the other side of that edge is like, why in the heck did I do this? Like, look at what I lost and what I was sacrificed. And it's funny because parenthood feels like you're always just on the other edge of it's worth it. It's never like you're fully on one side or the other side. It's like I'll be right on the edge of like, man, what the heck? I just need to like get out of here. Like, what am I doing? And then, your kid will come to you and just snuggle up to you on the couch for whatever reason. You go like, and they just push it right on the other edge of like, it's worth it, And so that's been my experience. I love my kids. It's work. It's hard. It's it's all of that. But yeah, there's no looking back at this point.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. For me, getting back into the caves, it was really stressful, to be honest. Like the first day was okay because I wasn't having to do anything. Like my instructor did a demo dive where he showed me the skills that I obviously did before, but it had been a while. But then the second day was rough because I was put in that number one position and had to lay out the primary line, do the jumps, do everything. And on top of that, in the dry suit, I made the mistake of not bringing the right undergarments. Like I had asked about it, and I was way too hot. It was the first time in my diving career that I was hot underwater, and that dive was awful. Like
Mm.
it was okay going in, but then we started coming out, which was good. I was going to call the dive anyway if we hadn't, because I was starting to get uncomfortable. But then, of course, that's when all hell breaks loose in training dives where, your light is broken, you're going out blind, like all these things. And so, like, the compounding problems just increased my stress and increased my internal heat. And
Mm-hmm.
I just, oh man, that dive was rough. It was rough. So I don't know. It's been, that was 2 days ago. And then yesterday I had a much, much better dive because I adjusted what I was wearing and everything. But I still just don't quite find that like comfort point, of being like we were talking about being in the zone. I have glimpses, like I have moments of them, but I don't know if it's just like my brain and how ADD I am, but it's like it's too much to focus on and pay attention to, and like I'm exhausted by the time I'm coming out,
Mm.
just with like one dive. I'm exhausted. And again, it's probably just lack of experience and all of that that comes with time and everything. But uh yeah, I don't know. I had like these little moments, and I hadn't gotten out my camera or anything. Like I've been just focused on the caves and whatever. There were a couple of moments where I was like, okay, I feel comfortable. The line isn't going to disappear all of a sudden. My buddies aren't going to poof, disappear and leave me. Like I don't know what it is about my brain that thinks that all of a sudden I'm going to be alone in a cave. That's just where my brain goes. But I had these moments of like, okay, I feel good, and like, wow, this is incredible. And I got out my camera and I took some videos, and those moments I was like, okay, I kind of get why people are into this.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting because my experience in the cave environment, um, I remember a particular dive where I was a bit tense before the dive because we were going into the cave right after Lamar Hines, who's the owner of Dive Right, and his son. We had hung out with them before and all this stuff. but this is their home turf, and we were kind of going in the cave right after them. We were literally the next team in. And I remember feeling tense, like I needed to perform, or I don't know. I don't know if you've ever felt that, where like you want to put on a
100%.
good showing, like, which is totally in your brain. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember, thank God my teammate at the time was like, "Dude, where's your brain?" And I was like, "Oh, good question." Like I'm in this, like, I'm tense. I'm like too much in my head, and I had to take a minute. I had to breathe. I had to take a minute. Like, look, we're just going in the cave. It's all good. I've never been in this particular cave, but it's all, like you said, the line's not going to disappear, and if it does, we're okay. I'm taking mental notes. Like my teammates, I can trust. Like all these sorts of things. But I still have gas on my back. Like everything's okay. But for me, those have been very rare. I find for myself, like in a cave environment, that the brain is the biggest tool you bring into any dive, but especially in a punishing environment like the cave. And so having the right mindset before you even get in the water, right? Before you even put on the dry suit, any of those sorts of things has been part of my preparation and part of what I really want to check in with myself. Because to be honest with you, no cave is worth it if you're not in the right state of mind. There's very few cases where, and I would say maybe there's like one where you're having to go into the cave to rescue someone, which is a totally different thing. And I don't think most of us ever get into that situation where you have to go into the cave. You have to do that dive. There's a lot that your brain says, well, I paid for the flight, I have all this gear, people are counting on me, all this stuff. But not being afraid to say, look, I'm just not in the right space to do this right now is the first check, right? Is the first thing that should happen. And so for me, that's become part of my, like, from the time I wake up on a cave diving day, it's like I'm checking in with myself. I'm making sure I'm actually excited to do this and in the right state of mind, which I would say the right state of mind is that I'm respectful. First of all, I understand what I'm taking on, and I'm comfortable with the skill set and the training and the things that I have in order to meet that same level of respect for the environment. When those things are balanced out, we're like, yeah, I don't feel I'm completely overwhelmed by what I'm about to go do, or I'm dismissive that what I'm about to go do is, safe inherently. When those two things are matched, it feels like the right state of mind for me to then go out and do a dive, rather than when they're unmatched, I'm overwhelmed, my brain's on 1,000 other things, or, oh yeah, I've done this cave 1,000 times, I got this.
The I
Those
got
are
this
things
attitude, that is the
that would
most,
trigger
like,
me.
that's the most dangerous position that you could be in. I got this is like, it's not gonna fly. My thing is understanding, like, having self-awareness and recognizing, like, because if I listening to you, if I were to take that advice, I would never go cave diving or tech diving, because I feel overwhelmed and stressed by it. Like, truly.
Mm.
That's just how, that's where I am. But I also know the like, my ability to perform under stress and overwhelm, if that makes sense. Like,
Mm.
I've had a lot of experience in varying levels of that. And so I know when it's like, oh, this is okay, this is manageable, versus like, no, this is not okay. Like, I'm a recovering anxiety person, that's something that, like, I deal with regularly. I have it pretty well under control at this point. Not under control, but I have more tools to work with it. But that's something that I think people probably, if they're not comfortable with it, like, maybe don't have experience with and, like, understanding of themselves. Because yeah, if I just went by that rule, I wouldn't be here. Like, I wouldn't be doing this. But I set myself up for success by not just saying, like, well, I'm a cave diver. I've got the certification, so I can come here and just go into a cave because I've done it before. No, that's not where I'm at. So I hired a friend who is an excellent, like I'm so blown away by how good of an instructor this guy is, Tavo from Dark Side Divers. Like, so great. I've known him for years. And so I decided to go with him and get like a proper refresher to help with that anxiety. Right? I
Mm.
felt like I was in a safer environment with somebody that I knew I could trust. This was the first time I was diving caves without iTor, which, like, if anybody has followed my journey with diving, iTor has been my security blanket as a diver.
Right,
Like,
right.
he's just always been there to like keep me calm and whatever. And so I set myself up for success in that sense by hiring someone to like lead me, to get my confidence back and to get my skills back to a level that are acceptable, instead of just like coming here and being like, I'm certified, so it'll be fine.
Yeah, no, and that's important, right? I mean, everything you're describing there is that self-awareness game, right? Is the brain. And it's one of those things that you've taken a lot of time to train, right? When you say you're a recovering anxiety person, I don't think that's the scientific term, but I like it.
No, but whatever.
Whatever it
I'm
is.
I'm recovering. I'm recovering in everything, like, honestly.
Yes. But the reason that you can use that word recovering is you have one, a self-awareness of it, and two, you put in a ton of work, right? And so your training of your brain outside of scuba, outside of cave diving, outside of any of this is again that muscle, that most important tool that you bring into any environment, but especially a punishing environment. And I think that's the thing when I say like the check in with myself, that's the thing that, again, the one of the reasons I feel comfortable or confident, but not cocky, and there's a line between those things in cave diving, is because I feel like I've received training that has been about my brain, right? About the way I approach it, that's been evaluating my thinking, not my, perfect, fin kick. But those are part of those things, but more about the thinking portion of it. And for me, um, that leads to a level of confidence in what I can handle and what I can't handle under the water. And on top of that, I think that I've been tried, I've been tested in a safe environment. There's never such thing as a completely safe, you know, training dive. But in as safe as you can be training dive inside of a cave, I've been tested. Yeah, had my valves rolled off. Yeah, I've had free flows. Yeah, I've had the minor things, lights go out and things like that, and have to react to those, not only for myself but with my team. And I think that's the other piece of it too, that is maybe doesn't get talked about in cave diving, and that you're kind of hitting on that is important, is there's a huge aspect too as to who you are willing to get in that environment with. And that was
Hmm.
my first lesson. I think I talked about it on the tech diving podcast, but that was one of the big lessons that I took out of all my tech training, was like, wow, the Rolodex or the list of people that I will go and do a big dive with like that is really small, because
Hmm.
I have to trust that person's training. I have to trust that person's, beyond that, their brain. And that's a big leap for, someone you're just meeting on the boat, or someone that you're, yeah, let's meet up and go cave diving together. Like that's one of those things that, again, for me, the comfortability of being confident in the water comes also from understanding my team and my support system that's under the water. So it's an important aspect of the mental game is, who are you with? And I think it cuts two ways. Sorry, I'm talking a lot about this, but it cuts two ways. There's one way of, I think, that's positive, which is I trust that teammates thinking, I trust that teammates training, and they trust mine. It's kind of looking across the table and knowing that we mutually understand each other. We mutually can execute this dive. The negative way that can cut is when you get into trust me dives, where, oh yeah, this person's has 1,000 cave dives, they said, so I can just follow them and everything will be fine. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's not the place to be, right? That's where it cuts too far of like follow me dive. That's super dangerous, I think, in your mind or in my mind. So it, I guess the emphasis on this is so much so that when you're in a very unforgiving environment, cave, inside of a challenging wreck, in open water, in Komodo, in a crazy current. You were telling the story on one of the surface intervals about hiding behind the rock, and Itor was there and kind of knew what to do to help you get away from the rock and actually get into the current. That's mental. It's not a perfect back kick. It's not breathing is for buoyancy. It's the mental game, and I think
Mhm.
that doesn't get enough play in training, and I certainly don't think it gets enough play in understanding why divers can do what they do, is the hours and work and time and effort they've put into training their minds as much as they have, if not more, the skill set they show underwater.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, it's just it's an interesting thing because and it's something that I'm going to reflect on in a YouTube video coming up with all of these experiences, but I want to visit fear and diving and kind of dissect, I'm spending some time to look at like what is it that I'm really afraid of here. And like, I know a big part of it is my brain just being hyperactive and thinking that the cave is going to collapse on myself. And it's like, bro, this cave is
Yeah.
so old. Like, you think it's really just going to suddenly collapse in the hour that you're in here, you know? And it was funny because I was having this conversation with one of my buddies. It was that dive that I got so hot on. Um, and I was telling him how he lights up when he talks about the caverns and the caves, kind of like you. And he's like, it's just the most amazing thing and all this. I'm like, I haven't gotten there yet. It's just not there. And we were talking about other diving experience because he does the bull shark diving here in Playa del Carmen as well. He's one of the guides for bull shark
Oh
diving.
yeah.
And I was like, see, I don't have any problems with sharks. Like, I even told him I've been in the water with saltwater crocodiles. Like, I showed him a video of me
Oh,
with
no
a
way.
stick in the
No
water, like
way.
literally stick in the water with saltwater crocodiles. And he looked at me and he was like, "You're afraid of a freaking cave? Like, what is wrong with
Exactly.
you?"
That's exactly my thoughts.
But again, like, I think it's because I have more experience and time with animals. Like, I've spent my whole life around a wide variety of animals. And so, and with that experience, I had training for like what to do and how they behave and all of those things. Whereas with cave diving, it's just been very like, get through the course and then like start working and not have like this foundation. We talked a lot about the foundation of cave diving and how that keeps you safe, right? Like those basic skills, trim, buoyancy, propulsion, um, and the mental part of it. Obviously, we've talked about extensively already, but it's I didn't develop that fully when I was here last time 6 or 7 years ago. And so it was cool to come back and have that, although it's still like I still feel like I don't fully have it, just because even though I have a decent amount of dry suit dives at this point, I still just, there is something about the dry suit that man, I am it's mm, there's just little tweaking that still doesn't quite I don't feel as solid as I do in a wetsuit. Like I feel like I can
Mm.
just hang, and be super cozy. But with the dry suit, it's like I'm Goldilocks. Like I haven't found that perfect combination of fins and undergarments and weights and how to move the air around and everything. Like I don't know, it's a learning process for sure. The whole experience has been very humbling because I have plenty of dives, but you can feel like an open water diver with plenty of dives.
Exactly. Yeah, like rebreathe your dive one back to
Yeah,
your open water days.
right.
Yeah, no, I mean, dry suit's funny. I feel I'm completely the opposite. If I put on, I haven't worn a wetsuit in I don't know how long, and if I put on a wetsuit, even in the pool, everything just feels wonky to me. Versus like dry suit just feels like,
It's
it's
home.
my home.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and I probably at risk of sounding like a broken record because I often do, but I explain to my students a lot that the brain is a tricky thing because I relate it back to, you can use whatever analogy you want here, but I always relate it back to, the first computer that I was ever, exposed to was this old IBM computer. And my mom was super proud that we had it. And I remember when I got my first computer game, it was Carmen San Diego, and, you had to
Cute.
follow her around the world and follow the trail. And it's funny because to play that game, you had to start up the computer, which took forever, and then you had to put in the disk, right? The floppy disk or the
Yep.
little whatever. I don't remember the other size of disk that they call them, but you had to put that in, and then the computer could run that program. But it couldn't do that if you wanted to stop playing the game and type, something and print it out on those old dot matrix printers. You had to take that disk out and put in the word processing one, right? And it stuck with me in terms of the power of the processor. Nowadays, I mean, we probably have 70,000 things open on our phones, and
Literally,
the
like
chip can
all
handle
the
all that
tabs.
stuff, right? Yeah, that's like the word. I have tab like anxiety. If I look at my wife's computer, for example, there's like 70 tabs in one window. You're like, how do you live with yourself? Like, how do you do this? Like, oh, it stresses me out. I have to close things and open other things. Like, I just don't do the tab thing. But those older computers couldn't handle it, and I equate it for my students in the same way with our brain, that when we're in the learning mode, when something's new, something's, you know, different or challenging to us, it's taking most of our processing power to focus on that thing. Right? If you think back to your open water dives, just getting underwater took all of your focus, right? Getting sinking took all the focus, right? And when you're working on something like, let's take buoyancy, for example. When you're thinking about buoyancy, you say, look, buoyancy is controlled by my breath. If I'm neutral in the water, properly weighted with a balanced rig, if I breathe in, I have, about 4 to 6 pounds of lift in my lungs. If I breathe out, I can drop 4 to 6 pounds of lift out, and I should go up and down. For a lot of divers, this is a new concept, right? That they say here breathing is for buoyancy, but they need to breathe for 3 to 5 seconds ahead of themselves. Hey, I want to go up in 3 seconds. Hold it in for a second. Oh, there you go. Now breathe out, normal breathing, right? Find neutral. When you're thinking about that for the first time, putting intense focus on it, seeing the cause and effect of your breathing, that buoyancy program takes all the bandwidth, takes all. Right? You're not thinking about the compass heading anymore. You're not thinking about your fitting technique. You're not thinking about your dry suit or your wetsuit or the how much gas you have. You're thinking about breathing. That's it. And when that program's running so intensely, we focus fully on it. In other words, our view of focus narrows, perception narrows to a very small point. And what I always tell my students is the goal in your training is to start to put these things in the background operating system. right? I don't think about breathing is for buoyancy anymore when I dive. I did for a long time when I was learning it, but now I don't. I don't think about my back kick. It just happens because I put in the work. But gosh, when I was learning it, it's all I could think about. And all I could think about was how bad I was at it, right? And so these things, as you progress, and I think it goes back to something we were saying in a lot of our episodes, is progressing along that plateau, not too fast, not pushing yourself to be in a super punishing environment, on top of not putting buoyancy in the background, but in the foreground of your thinking. It just is going to overload that computer, that brain, and it puts you in a really dangerous spot, regardless of, it just compounds when you're in an overhead environment like a cave.
Well,
So anyway, my
that
point being is training the
yeah.
brain.
Yeah, that was the interesting thing for me, because I had gotten into a place of feeling very comfortable in the dry suit in the open ocean, right? Like that's what I've been doing. But the second that I got into cave and was starting to work these other skills, problems with equipment or out of air or whatever, it was like all of a sudden, oh, that thing that I feel like I had gotten decent at, like I felt I was feeling more comfortable. It, uh, like it wasn't super great anymore. And so yeah, I don't know. It's just an interesting thing. It's a humbling experience to um move forward with things and move forward with training. um I don't know. It's what's nice for me is part of the reason why, going back to like my fear of caves, is the fact that I'm just like not a naturally good navigation, like somebody who's confident with navigation. It's just not like a skill set of mine. I get lost all the time on land. Like it's gotten a lot better these days, a lot. And I think it's really funny that like one of my most popular YouTube videos is about compass navigation for beginners, because I'm just like the chronically lost person, but not necessarily underwater. Not necessarily underwater these days for like normal dives. But I wouldn't have said like growing up and to this point that like, oh, I'm great at knowing where I am in the world. And that's also part of like the mental game. And so what's been cool about this time around, like even though I've struggled with some of the skills and the buoyancy, my sense of where I am, oh my gosh, like that actually clicked. And I think that's because I'm just more experienced at this point, where like I'm in the cave, we've done the briefing and we've talked about the plan and everything, and I'm like, I know where I am. You know? That never really clicked for me when I was doing the course before. So it's really cool. If that's
Mm.
something that I guess I want to encourage people, like if you're like me, you've experienced some kind of diving that you're like, like I don't know about that. Maybe don't shut the door on it completely. It just might not be the right time for you. And that's kind of where I am with cave diving. Like I'm open to it. I don't know if it's going to be my thing, but like now that I have more experience, I don't feel like I'm lost in the world. I don't feel like I don't know. It seems like it's something that I could be comfortable with at some point with more experience.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, and I mean, I think you bring out a really good point in the sense that those plateaus aren't static, right? That you can be on a plateau where you come out of something feeling really good or comfortable, and then that can regress, and you need to get back there. And navigation is a great example of that, right? Where, I mean, you could feel great about your navigation skills, and then I remember I was in Florida on a dive, and And we, you know, it was this easy open water ocean dive. Like it shouldn't be that hard, but there was this slight annoying current, like slight enough where it wasn't pushing you, like you felt it a ton, but strong enough where you know, the compass bearing just didn't matter anymore in terms of distance, right? You could take the right bearing, but distance, you were completely off. And I remember we came up, and I thought, you know, I was really focused on navigation on this particular dive because I'm like, no, we're going to hit the ladder on the boat when we decide to surface. That's because I was diving the one, like we're doing it. I remember I'm like, I was so confident. Here we are. We're here. And I was like, all right, we're going up. We pop up from this dive, you know, and we're like 50 yards from the boat or something. You know, it's like, are you kidding me? Like we're in the right direction, but I counted kicks. Like you're kidding me. You know, like you're kidding me. And anyway, so we go back down. I'm like, okay, I got it now. Now I have a, you know, spatial understanding of how far we are, and we're 20 yards past the boat. The next time I come up, it's like, my goodness. And those things are so interesting because again, you can have all confidence in all that in the world, and then you throw in a different environment, you throw in a different teammate, you throw in a dry suit versus a wetsuit, you throw in a, you know, you're diving a wing now versus a jacket. You know, these things kick us back into learning mode. And
Yeah.
I literally asked, I asked a couple of instructors on the boat, I was like, how in the world did you navigate like that? Because I was spot on with the navigation, completely off with the distance. And they're like, look, there's no shame in a little peek and duck. And I was like, what's a peek and duck? Like, take a little peek and duck back down into the water, you know, when no one's looking, to make sure, you know, you're on the right track. I was like, okay, now I know it.
Okay, so after the surface interval conversation with Aitor, I had him do a TikTok with me where we talked about some of our diving experience in Komodo. And I ended up sharing it on my YouTube channel, which, like, normally I would make like a big fancy vlog and like spend hours and hours editing these things, whatever. I threw this thing together in like a few hours because it was Saturday night and I wanted to have something uploaded on Sunday. This was literally like a few days ago. Of course it's done great, you know? And we talked about it's always those videos that you don't spend a lot of time on. You're like, this is crap. Like, I hate this, but here it is. And then everybody watches it and you're like, come on, you know, like watch the one that I spent 20 hours on. Like, come on.
Right.
But we talked about periscoping. That's what we call it.
Periscoping. That's a good one. Yeah, that's the same thing, right? Peek and duck.
And somebody got on my case about it. They were like, that's really dangerous. I'm like, I understand that like going up and coming back down is not ideal, but you know, sometimes it happens. Sometimes you need to do it. And like, if you've been diving conservatively, hopefully you're going to be safe. You know, you're not pushing your DCS risk. But if you're not diving conservatively and you're not taking care of yourself, your physical health, you're dehydrated or whatever else, then yeah, it can be really dangerous. It's not like you don't go out with the goal of doing that. It's just like, we messed up. We got to get back to where we started, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, they call that the yo-yo diving, or, you know, dip diving,
Right.
and those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, you can do that. You can do it like you're saying and minimize the risk of it, right? You obviously don't bolt to the surface and
No,
periscope out and
gosh.
bolt back down, right?
No.
Which is sometimes the assumption that people make of like that. No, you ascend safely and descend safely, slowly, under control, making stops as needed to make that little peekaboo. But yeah, you know, look, this is why it's so important to be what we call, at least at UTD, a thinking diver. What I would expand that to say is to be switched on when we're in the underwater environment. Turn the brain on, and not be a protocol diver. The protocol meaning you just do the same thing, whatever you were taught, because that's what you were taught, right? Every single time, because the environment is constantly changing. The same dive site, the same cave, the same open water 20-foot dive that you take every Wednesday can change so dramatically from dive to dive, even within a day, right? Within the same day. And
Yeah.
so being switched on, thinking it through, all of that stuff. And that's the thing, I think, when it comes to diving in general, and especially in cave environments and things, is the more that you are switched on, the more that you are, engaged in that dive, that you're thinking through, that you're not letting things just pass. Like, that's one of the things that I really like to try and do, is when I come out of a cave, is to come back to the map of that cave and trace exactly what we did, and then make my own little, and this part of the cave would look like this, and this. And even during the dive, I'll take out my wet notes and draw a little, like, this is a really cool, remember that shelf I was talking about? I drew that, and where I thought we were on the line and things. And then sometimes, you'll be surprised, like, oh wow, I felt like we were way further past this point. And then you start to add in there, okay, where are you, in cardinal navigation, under the cave, it doesn't really matter. The way in is the way out in a lot of ways. But do I think which way am I facing? Am I facing north? Am I facing south? Like, okay, I remember the entrance to the cave was facing, east, and we went this way. So again, keeping your brain switched on. And when you feel that laziness maybe click on, or that comfortability of like, oh yeah, I got this, no big deal. It's that, like, okay, remember where you are. How do I re-engage in this in some way? Because I think a lot of the diving accidents that I read about, because they say, cave diving is amongst one of the 5 most dangerous sports in the world.
Yeah.
Which I kind of laugh at, because then they compare it to things like, base jumping and high altitude climbing, which I think those guys are crazy. And it's funny, I was talking to a buddy of mine who is a base jumper. And I just think he's nuts. Like, there's a big, like, base jumping to do. I don't think it's a competition. Maybe it is, in Kuala Lumpur. And he was telling me about it. He showed me some videos of this tower that I had been to in Kuala Lumpur. I'm like, are you like, literally they jump off the tower and jump off of that, pop the parachute, land somewhere in the city, and there's an army of these guys on scooters that go and find the guy who jumped. He packs up his chute, jumps on the back of the scooter, they drive him back to the tower, and they do it again. And I'm like, you guys are nuts. And he looks at me and says, you're a cave diver, you're nuts. Like, why would you ever do that? I don't see it in that view. And we don't see eye to eye. He thinks, his training with base jumping, all that stuff, is probably the same way I feel about cave diving. And so it's not necessarily like a definitive fact that cave diving is the most dangerous sport in the world. I think where that becomes true is that cave diving, without the proper respect, without the proper mental aspect, without the proper gear, without the proper training, is extremely dangerous. But when you're able to mitigate a lot of those things, it's still dangerous.
Yeah.
It's still a place where every time that you do it, no matter how many times you've been in that same cave, you are risking your life. It's a serious thing. And you have to be aware of that. But all of that training, all that is meant to mitigate that risk to a point that you are comfortable taking it. And that's the same thing with base. I'm not comfortable jumping off a freaking tower in Kuala Lumpur. No way. That's crazy. But I have zero training. I have zero mental capacity for what that feels like. I have zero desire to do it. So, of course, it's completely dangerous. If I go do what he does, I'm an idiot, right? I deserve to be part of the statistics.
Right.
And the same is true on the other end. If you're a cave diver who, I don't need training, this sign with the big Grim Reaper on it, that's just a funny joke. Or yeah, of course, I'm a great diver. I could dive into a cave. It doesn't look that hard. I watched all these YouTube videos on it. Sarah's YouTube video on her cave. It looks awesome. I'm gonna go do that tomorrow. If you don't have a healthy respect for it and you don't put in the work, exactly, then yes, it's extremely dangerous. But you mitigate that danger with the level of preparedness that you come into it with, and you accept the level that you can't control: the cave collapsing, the line snapping, gear going out, and yes, you have backup gear, all those things. The biggest thing and broken record, but that I say is, like, the thing that you you protect not only for yourself, but the reason that you have your team there is protecting that brain and the way that you're thinking about it. That's when you dig into the accident reports, when you dig into the fatalities in cave diving, when you dig into these things, the data bears out that it is almost always they call it diver error, which is translated to it was the brain that broke, or the collection of brains that broke, not
It,
the regulator, not the line, not the light, not the light might have broke, but the brain went with it.
well, it's interesting that you say that because I'm actually reading Under Pressure. Have you read that book? Um, oh gosh,
Yes.
by Gareth Locke.
Yep.
It's so it talks about that reasoning, like, oh, it's human error. That's actually like a really poor description of what the problem really was, right? Like, it's not a good way of describing what happened in an accident because it doesn't allow for dissecting the issues in the systems that people were using, right, in their training or
Yep.
their briefings or whatever. So I think that's really interesting. And since you've listened or you've read it, I would love to have a conversation on the podcast about the book and risks and things like that once I actually finish it, which is proving to be quite difficult because it's not a book that I can read before bed. So it means that I don't get a lot of time to read. But
That's true.
it's
It's not a good night read, that's
I
true, or a
do
pre-dive read either.
no no, but I do like a little book club with my Patreon community, and this was actually our January book, and now we're ending February, and I still haven't finished it. And I'm like, I'm telling my guys, I'm like, I'm so sorry, it's taking me forever to read this book, but it's just like it's a lot to get through, It's not just like an easy read.
Yeah, no, I mean, last season Gareth came on the show and we played a little fun mental game. We took a dive together and talked about all these, what he's deemed, or he hasn't deemed, but he's brought into the diving, human factors. And you're absolutely right. There's a cascade of things, everything from just the mental approach to the dive, all the way back to the training, to the normalization of things that you were, I've taken 100 dives with, this gear bubbling a little bit and I've been fine. That's the normalization of deviance, right? And all these sorts of things. And I think the biggest point to take away from all of that is the diligence that goes into the mind and the collective, shared mind of the team in diving, and how important that is. It's work, and it's cool, to be part of, I think, an agency that's from day one incorporated a lot of that stuff, just by nature of who we are. And I think it's important for divers to understand, because diving is such a gear intensive sport, we have to have the gear to do what we do as an activity. That sometimes we lose the function and mechanism of the gear for the brain, and super critical to keep that at the forefront of your training and keep it in the forefront of your dives. And a book like Under Pressure from Gareth is a great book to read. Well, good. I think this will wrap this episode up. It's been a good discussion off the cuff about cave diving. I hope it didn't come off too preachy or anything like that. We'll wrap this one up. If you enjoyed this episode, we really encourage you to subscribe so you get notified every time that new podcasts drop. You can also engage with us directly on our Facebook group or the community that's been building there. Find it on Facebook. Just search The Dive Table. And you can also connect on our website, thedivetable.com, where you can get our library of episodes, transcripts, so on and so forth, all the things producer Daniel does. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode, and we hope to see you back on the next episode of The Dive Table.